How do you know? Good question. When talking to people about whether or not God exists, you may have discovered that people are open to discussing God's existence as long as you don't use the Bible. Last time we discussed Leibniz's contingency argument to show through how a logical syllogism it's reasonable to believe that a God exists. This week we'll be looking at another argument, the Kalam cosmological argument. It's a long name, a short argument, and lots of defending. Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Ghazali was a prominent Muslim. Yes, a Muslim. The Kalam cosmological argument doesn't promote belief in Allah, nor does it promote belief in God. Rather, like other arguments of this type, the focus is not on a particular God's existence, but it shows that the best explanation for some philosophical questions and arguments is a deity of some sort. If God is an objective truth, meaning his actuality isn't contingent on anyone's preferences or beliefs, then any argument from any religion that presents the belief in a deity as a rational conclusion to a rational argument is acceptable by Christians. We may dislike where the argument came from, but this doesn't mean it isn't sound. That'd be committing the fallacy of Bulverism. Coined by C.S. Lewis, the Bulverism fallacy is committed when a person assumes an opponent's position is wrong by focusing on how a person came to believe that position. So then, Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Ghazali was a prominent Muslim who lived in Persia, or modern-day Iran, between 1055 and 1106 AD. He was a teacher, theologian, author, and philosopher. He argued that it was absurd to believe that the universe was beginningless, which was the predominant Greco-Roman belief that was still held by many other philosophers at that time. Inspired by earlier Christian arguments, the Kalam, which means science of discourse or conversation, cosmological argument took place. It's two premises and one conclusion. Premise 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And that's it. Well, sort of. Just as with Leibniz's argument, Ghazali's argument still needs to be defended from persons who dislike the argument's implications. Let's begin with premise 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. This premise is supported by 3 reasons. Reason 1. Something cannot come from nothing. Some scientists will suggest that certain subatomic particles can come from a vacuum. That is what laymen call nothing. However, when the term vacuum is being used, it doesn't really mean the absence of everything, but rather a sea of fluctuating energy governed by physical laws and that has a physical structure. So, not nothing. Ultimately, scientists and atheists must agree that nothing comes from nothing.
Nothing comes from nothing. Nothing.
If nothing comes from nothing, that would be like magic, but worse. At least the magician has a hat and a bunny. Reason number 2. If some things can just pop into being from nothing, then we should see this happening all the time. But we don't. Many atheists will respond to this by saying the universe just came into being from nothing, but everything in the universe surely has a cause. But this is again the taxicab fallacy, which we discussed in our last video. Another objection is that God also cannot just come into being uncaused. However, this misses the point. If a being were God, and God's attributes included being spaceless and timeless, since he created time and space, then God would be outside a temporal dimension, meaning no beginning and no end. Now, atheists will call out Christians and say that they're committing the fallacy of special pleading concerning God. A special pleading happens when a person argues an exception to an accepted principle or standard without any justification. However, special pleading is not being committed for God, rather it's being committed by the atheist, who explains that the universe, which is material, doesn't have a cause, but then demands that God, who might be immaterial, must have one, for no real reason. And reason number 3. Common experience and scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise 1. Premise 1 is only ever verified and never falsified. None of us have ever actually seen things just popping into being from nothing. We never could, and we never will. This takes us to premise 2. The universe began to exist. Now, this is the premise where most of the objections come into play. There are 4 reasons, though, why premise 2 is true. 2 philosophical arguments and 2 scientific arguments. Let's look at the philosophical arguments first. Number 1. An actually infinite number of things cannot exist. When we say something is infinite, we mean that it is limitless or endless in space, extent, or size. Ghazali differentiated between two types of infinities: a potentially infinite set of things and an actually infinite set of things. When things are potentially infinite, infinity is an ideal limit that is never really reached. Imagine dividing a distance in half, then half that 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 half. This leads to an absurdity, or the quality or state of being ridiculous, because though there is a potential infinity present in the division of having halves by have-havedly, you can't actually do this. The first objection is that the argument against any actually infinite set of things has been invalidated by modern mathematics. For instance, I can have a set of infinite numbers, such as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, infinitely. However, what this objection fails to recognize is just because you can talk about actually infinite sets of numbers without contradiction, it doesn't mean that an actually infinite set exists. Actually, numbers are symbols that represent abstract ideas. Numbers aren't actually real. They don't exist in reality. They are human constructs that help us relate information to one another, convenient fabrications that represent ideas. Even with numbers, though, we find just how absurd actually infinity is when applied mathematically. For instance, what is infinity minus infinity? Well, it could be both infinity or zero. But if it's zero, then infinity can actually end. I've added the link for Hilbert's Hotel, which is a thought experiment about the application of infinity. It's a good video and I encourage you to watch it if you want to learn more about the absurdities of applying actually infinite sets of things to real life. Here we can see that while a potentially infinite number of things could exist, an actually infinite number of things could not exist. The second philosophical argument is that you can't pass through an infinite number of elements one at a time. Ghazali observed that the series of past events was formed by adding one event to another, like a timeline or a number line. We can see this when you try to count to infinity. No matter how high you count, you still have an infinite number to go. Here's the conundrum. If you can't count to infinity, then how could you ever count from infinity? Before you reach zero on a number line, you would have to count down from infinity infinitely, meaning that philosophically you would never actually reach zero on a number line because you would be infinitely counting down from a negated infinity. This shows an actual number of past events must be finite, or else we never would have reached today, which we have, I think. The primary atheist objection to this is that though the number line is infinite, the past events on the line are a finite distance from the present. Look at history. Starting from the year zero, we can trace back an indefinite amount of past events finitely from zero. Therefore, an infinite number of past events is actual. Now this is where we meet another fallacy, the fallacy of composition. This fallacy is committed when a person assumes that a truth of the parts of a thing must be true of the whole thing. For instance, every part of a human might be light in weight, but a human could actually be very weighty when all the parts are present. The question isn't about how many finite parts make up an infinite timeline, but rather how the whole beginningless past could be completed by adding an infinite number of finite parts one after another. The absurdity of an actually infinite set of things is obvious. If there is an actually infinite past, then we never would have arrived at today. Everything within the observable universe and the rules of logic dictate that the actual number of infinite past events is impossible. The absurdity of an actually infinite set of things is obvious. If there's an actually infinite past, then we would never have arrived at today. Everything within the observable universe and the rules of logic dictate that an actual number of infinite past events is impossible. Now on to the scientific arguments. First, the expansion of the universe. If the philosophical arguments weren't enough for you, modern science indicates that the universe has a beginning. The best model for the universe coming into existence to its current state is called the Big Bang model, taken from the Big Bang Theory.
Our whole universe was in a hot, dense state that nearly 14 billion years ago expansion started.
No, not that theory. Yes, think that theory. Albert Einstein assumed, like many, that in the universe things were moving and changing, but that the universe itself was rather stagnant. Unfortunately for him, he discovered that his equations depicted a universe that was either blowing up like a balloon or collapsing upon himself. Not liking this, he fudged his numbers. Einstein lied. In the 1920s, taking Einstein's equations at face value, Russian mathematician Alexander Friedmann and Belgian astronomer George Lemar came up with two independent models that both showed the universe expanding, proving Einstein wrong, which he already was. This led them to conclude independently of each other that the reason our solar system looked like the center of the universe was the same reason that anywhere in the universe looked like the center of the universe, because the galaxies weren't just moving away from one another, space itself was expanding. The universe was spreading out like a balloon with dots on it. Everywhere was moving away from every point, but no point on the surface was the center. Later, in 1929, Edwin Hubble noticed a red shift of light from distant galaxies, and that these trails of light indicated that all the galaxies were not just moving away, they were all moving away from each other. Couple this with the Friedmann-Lemar model of the universe, and we can see that the galaxies are actually at rest. It's the space around them that is expanding. If this is the case, then how does this help defend the premise that the universe began to exist? Easy. If everything is all moving away from each other as space expands, all we have to do is hit rewind. Here will we see that by reversing the direction of the universe's expansion, it leads to a single finite point in the past, a singularity from which all time, space, matter, and energy begins to exist. Now, other models have been presented over the decades. However, none of them truly remain scientific. They become philosophical or metaphysical, abandoning the scientific method for the scientific not method. Attached in the description is a link for these other universe models. The Big Bang model and theory are the best scientific explanations of the scientific data. The second scientific argument is the thermodynamics of the universe. The three laws of thermodynamics are: first, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only change forms. In any process, the total energy of the universe remains the same. Second, the entropy, or disorder, of an isolated system not in equilibrium, or the state where opposed forces are balanced, will tend to increase over time, approaching a maximum value at equilibrium. Third, as temperatures approach absolute zero, the entropy of a system approaches a constant minimum. We'll be focusing on the second law. This law implies that given enough time, all the universe's energy will spread out evenly across space in a featureless soup where no life is possible. Here, the universe will have reached a point where the temperature and pressure are the same everywhere. The end of the universe will be in a whimper. It will simply die out in the frigid heat death of the universe. This brings us firmly to the conclusion: the universe has a cause. One philosopher once argued that the universe created itself, that before the universe came into being, the universe brought itself into being. No, I'm serious. That's what Daniel Dennett said. This guy, he said that thing. That crazy nonsense thing that he said that time. I heard it. I read it. So, if the universe is caused, what is that cause? Well, this cause must be uncaused, the uncaused first cause. It must transcend space and time, since it created space and time at the same moment. It must be immaterial and non-physical, and it must be unimaginably powerful to have brought all matter and energy into existence. And finally, this uncaused first cause must be a personal being. Ghazali argued that the creating of the universe isn't out of necessity. This being didn't have to create at all, but it did. So the creating of the universe was from an act of independence, free from any prior conditions. Therefore, the best explanation as to what caused the universe to exist is God. Whew, we made it! That was a long and hard video, but you'll be ready to use this argument when talking about whether or not it is reasonable for God to exist with your non-believing friends, after a little practice and some possible repeat viewings of this video. I did it again. Yeah. Thanks for joining us today. Next time we'll look at the teleological argument, or the argument from design. I'm Taylor Drake with Timothy Ministries. Happy reasoning and blessings.